All right. So like Mike said, my name is Simon Stewart, and I'm going to talk about Chrome DevTools. So the intention is not to pretend to be an expert, which is normally what you do when you give a talk. I'm really just here to kind of throw a whole bunch of things that I've seen that I think are pretty useful. Some are kind of more kind of niche, and some are ones that you probably all know, which is fine. So just kind of look really excited when I show you that. I work at a company called Bridgement, so this is not a sales pitch, but I work there. Just in case you leave kind of halfway through the information slide, I'll show you at the end. Chrome DevTools has got a really good Twitter account, so I really recommend just kind of keeping an eye on it. You don't have to do it every day, but just to kind of keep an eye on what's happening. And Clarice did a really good article for Puppeteer as well. So definitely have a look at that. There's also a whole bunch of stuff on YouTube. So if you've got the appetite for that, then dig in. And that's my slides. Not that I didn't prepare, it's just ASCII for the win. Okay, cool. So like I said, I'm just going to kind of group them, and I'm just going to show you a whole bunch of things. The only thing I'm going to ask, because I know how much we like to interact as developers, is just kind of put your hand up if it's something that you haven't seen before. You don't have to be too enthusiastic, just to kind of give me an idea whether I've missed the mark or not quite missed the mark. Okay, so the first one, which is completely out of context, but I'm just going to show it anyway because it was quite cool, is the fact that you can zoom into Chrome DevTools independent of the browser, which I thought was quite cool. So, and I think they do that because the average age seems to coincide with my age as it gets more and more. So I think that's why. So you can zoom in. But it's quite cool because you can zoom in without zooming into the whole thing and destroying the viewport. So that's the one. The next one is they've unified the way you can do searching. So there are actually two ways to do it. The one is Shift Command P. It's on a Mac, which brings up that one. And the other one is just Command P, but they're actually the same thing because the one's just got a chevron in front of it. So this is a nice way to get into a whole bunch of the different bits of functionality inside of Chrome DevTools. So for instance, important things like switching on the dark theme, you can now access without having to dig in, and then hopefully remember how to disable it. Switch to light theme. And also you can, as you can see, they have a section as a badge in front of the command, so you can pretty easily figure out what's kind of, if you do performance, you can kind of see what's going on there. So they just help to make it a bit more discoverable, which I think is quite useful. Because one of the things with Chrome DevTools, and it's great, but they tend to change things a whole bunch, all the time. So whole tabs will just appear and be merged into other things, and external tools will just appear and get merged into other tabs. So you need to kind of just keep up to date on what's going on. But that's where the YouTube channel really comes in. Because for every release of Chrome, every kind of 6 weeks, they tend to release a bit of an advert about DevTools, which is pretty useful. Okay, the next one is, so let's get rid of DevTools. So obviously you can click in the top left corner to refresh. That's not new to anyone else. But if DevTools is open, you can double finger click. I don't know what it is on a Windows machine, I forgot. Right click, that's what I meant. And it brings up a couple of options. So instead of having to kind of remember how to do a hard refresh or anything, you can do it. I did Windows for the first 15 years, and I just seem to have forgotten everything. Okay, the next one, which is quite cool, let me just start the demo. So I am using Angular, but it really doesn't matter what you're using. In fact, Angular was probably not the best thing to demo because a lot of the scripts kind of get pulled into other scripts, and it's a bit tricky to kind of debug things from a DevTools point of view. But, well, that's what I did. So this is my demo. So don't hire me to do front ends. So let me just zoom in so you can appreciate the full glory of that. And I'm also colorblind as well, so it's just to kind of add insult to injury. So anyway, but that's not really the actual thing I wanted to show you. Okay, so what you can do really simply now is, without having to use external like extensions, is you can do screenshots. So you can do a full screen screenshot. So if you zoom right down to the bottom, there's the thing that says below the fold. So if I do a capture full size screenshot and I open it, then you can see right at the bottom, which is pretty useful. So occasionally you want to demo like the full glory of what you've done, and you don't want to just kind of do it like manually or zoom all the way out, which I tend to do. So now you can do it in a much better way. The other one related to screenshots is if I select an element, I can say capture node screenshot, and it'll just capture that. I don't think I zoomed. I think maybe the zoom broke it. Can you just give me 1 sec? Let me try that again. So I'm on the button, say capture node screenshot, and there we go. So if you just wanted to capture one like specific DOM element, obviously it'll do the whole tree. See how that's a 1 meg image of a button, which obviously you can put in a Word doc and send to your designers. They'll love that. But anyway, that is pretty useful. The next thing you can do, obviously, is, well, not obviously, because a whole bunch of these things I haven't known like for a whole lot of time, is you can search for a file. So this is the file within the context of your site. So I just have an external script called console.logs.js. So you can search for that, which is pretty useful, and you can obviously kind of view it. The next thing that you can do, which is pretty useful as well, is you can actually search within the files that are loaded. So you can see here I've just searched for add numbers, which is this function I'm going to kind of demo in a minute. And if I just zoom in a little bit, so it will actually show you the script files and the HTML files that have that phrasing, which is quite useful. Because fairly often you'll have some bit of hard-coded markup or something, and instead of going into your editor, you can actually do it through this, which is pretty useful. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the sources again. 1 second. Okay, so I've just got for those not familiar with Angular, it doesn't really matter. I just want to reload that. So this is to kind of mimic a minified file. It's not really minified. I just like took the line breaks out. But for all intents and purposes, it's minified enough. So if I find the same file, I can see it there, but obviously it's not as readable. So in the bottom left corner, the little curly braces is a way to prettify it. So this is not getting the original. This is just Chrome kind of try to make it as pretty as possible, which is useful enough. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the CSS ones. So if I click on that cool button that I did, which ironically is also called cool button as a class, you can command click on the actual CSS, and it will take you to that part of the CSS file, which is pretty useful. Because occasionally you want to actually go and find the place in the file and actually kind of figure out what's going on. Cool. So I'm just going to zoom out. It's like really difficult to look at it when it's so small. And what you most probably know about is the ability to add effectively inline styles, except in DevTools. So you can start kind of experimenting with stuff. The other thing that you can do is to actually add a tiny new CSS property. So if you wanted to actually add a new property and go and do some stuff, instead of just putting it as an inline thing, you can just click that plus button, and it will look at the element that you're on and try and infer what that selector should be. So in this case, it's a button, and it's got the cool button class. So it tries to kind of make a guess about that, which is pretty useful. So the next thing, which is pretty useful, and I've seen this occasionally in Teams. It's difficult not to kind of laugh when somebody does it, but maybe that's just me being a bit of an idiot. So if you wanted to figure out what the hover state would be, instead of trying to hover and then move your mouse really quickly and think you're going to trick Chrome, which I'm sure we've all done.
Do that.
What you can do is you can go and toggle the state of that element, which is pretty useful. So you can toggle the state, and if you've got specific things that are going to apply to that element in that state, you'll see it in the bottom right corner. So it just makes it a bit simpler, a bit less fun, but it's a bit more productive. All right, so the next thing, which I'm sure we've all done, and I tend to do it like more than I'd care to admit, is, I'm just going to refresh just to kind of get back to a known state, is you go make a whole bunch of changes in CSS, in DevTools, and then you refresh or something happens and you lose all those changes and you can't remember what you've done. The amount of time that I wasted is unbelievable. So for those that don't know what I meant, so if you go and change the background to red and then you refresh, obviously it's lost all those things because it doesn't understand there's no state. Because you're not actually modifying the file, you're just modifying the state. So one of the cool things that you can do, which in 2 demos time will be the pinnacle of my talk, you'll see why, is what you can do is you can actually add an override folder. So I'm just going to make a folder called that. Let's see, I had some issues with it, kind of remembering old things. And you give it access to your file system because, I mean, what's the worst that can happen? And now what you can do is you can actually I can go and do the same demo. So if I click on that and I change this to, let's just change it to blue, something cool like that, and I do a refresh, it actually keeps a state, which is pretty useful. So what it's doing, and this is similar to, Chrome has had this idea of folders or workspaces for a long time, which I've never used because I just thought it was a bit of a hack, but maybe that was just me. This is pretty much the same thing, except you're kind of doing it on like a diff level. So you don't take all your source code and put it somewhere separate, it just kind of stores those diffs, which is pretty useful. So if you want to go make those changes, you can then make the changes, you can refresh, you're not going to lose anything. And then at the bottom, which is called the drawers, you can actually get a diff. You can't really see it very well. Let me zoom in. You can actually get a diff from what's been added to the original, and you can actually figure out. And hopefully from that point, you can then merge it back into your code. But we'll see. The other thing that you can do, which is pretty useful, is you can actually do the same thing. I'm trying to remember where to do it. Give me a minute. That is the issue with DevTools, is it does so much stuff, you actually got to try and remember where the thing is, or what filter you're applying. So if I open up an image in the sources view, so you can see the image, there's nothing really to see there. But using these local overrides, you can actually go and override an image. So let's go and pick a random image off my hard drive. What could go wrong? So refresh in there. I need to move DevTools so you can see. We might need to edit this out, depending if anyone complains. And there's a half-naked picture of Tony Danza and that other guy. Which you can't really see, and now it's worse because you can't really see it. Maybe that all backfired, I don't know. But what's pretty cool is you can actually go and modify a whole bunch of images. You can go and drag your new version in, and you can test how the rendering works in the site. And then obviously, if you actually want to commit those changes, you can go and do the diff, and then you can actually go and make whatever change you want. So it's not going to do the diff on the binary data, but I thought that was pretty cool. So that was that. Let's have a look. Okay, so that's image overriding. The other thing that you can do, which I can't really see a use case for, but I mean, it might be useful if you're like waiting to do like some major demo and you needed a whole bunch of changes done, is you can set design mode on the entire document. which means you can go in and actually go and make kind of inline changes, which is quite useful. Those ones are not going to be committed from these override styles. If you wanted to make those committable or persistable, the way you would need to do it is, I think, actually doing it in here, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe not. There was somewhere else that you actually, I think it was actually in the sources. So in the sources, you have to go and open up that HTML file, make the changes, and then it stores the diff. And then when the browser renders, it's going to figure out how to actually merge those two together, which I think is pretty cool. And then you can unenable the local overrides, and then that image disappears. Okay, so that's just a couple of things that you can do using the elements. The next one is using the console. So let's take a look at a couple of ones. So this is pretty useful. So everyone's used console.log. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of other things that you can do that aren't console.log. And one of them is console.count, and you give it like an identifier. And then whenever you run console.count, it's going to output whatever that string is and a number that it keeps an internal count of, which is pretty useful. Again, one of these things has probably been there for 10 years, and none of us actually found out about it. So that's quite a cool one. The next one is doing a console group. It's just a demo. So I'm just going to, just to kind of save time, I'm just going to do it in the console window. And it's pretty easy to add new lines, so to do it as one kind of block, and that's just to do the shift button and enter. So it actually does a new line. So if I do console.log, so say hello, and console.log, so say hello to, and the last one, so I can do console group n, and then it actually groups those together, which is pretty useful. Let me just zoom in so you can see. So instead of just having a whole lot of console logs, you can actually group them into a logical structure, and you can then do an expand collapse and actually kind of get some sort of value out of that. All jokes aside, I think there's still value in using console logs for some things, but I would just kind of use some of the additional bits that you get, so not just console log. Okay. So one of the problems that you get with console logs, and this is the VM is just because it's running actually inside of the browser. So let me just I'm just going to do a couple of clicks of the button just to kind of show you what's going on. So it shows us the component that we're in. We happen to be in a TypeScript component because it's Angular, but it doesn't actually show us the function that we're in, which is often what you want. So one of the ways that you can do it, and obviously you can use a third-party component to do that, but there's a script that Remy Sharp put together, which is pretty useful. So I'm just going to run that. So presuming that that's run as part of your kind of bootstrapping of your application, and let's just clear the logs. And if I do a click now, it looks a whole bunch messier than it was before, and you can obviously clean it up. But the benefit is you actually get the function and the whole kind of stack trace of where you were, which is pretty useful. So that might be something you want to switch on and off. But it's definitely something that I'm getting some use out of, which is cool. The next one, which is one of these things that I think's been there forever, but I never knew about it, is styling your console log, which is pretty useful. So you can actually do like a whole bunch of stuff. But one of the things that I'm using it for with one of my clients is to actually allow them to kind of decorate the console logs depending on the severity. There's other ways to do it, but it was just an easy way to actually get that going. So that's styling the console logs. And you can put, that's just CSS. It just happens to be in one string. So obviously if you had an array of bits of CSS, you can just join them together and then voila. pretty useful. I tried to do like animations and that didn't seem to work. I don't know if they just didn't implement it, but I'm sure with enough interest, someone will actually want to do that.
Shit spinning around your console. Chaos.
Well, I think that'll actually be the best thing ever. But anyway. Okay, so that's using some style. So the next thing which is pretty useful is to preserve the logs. So if you refresh your browser window, it clears out the console log, which is often what you want, but sometimes not what you want. So it's just a built-in toggle. So if I refresh now, it just depends. It doesn't destroy the log, which can be pretty useful. Obviously, you can delete at any point by doing that. And something else that's pretty useful that's also built in, you don't need any sort of third-party library to do that, is to enable timestamps. So if you wanted to keep a track of when those events were actually happening, you can just enable that. And as part of that console window, you can do whatever kind of filtering you want. So I know that there's console logs with the word something in it, so I can just type and I can filter those. You can obviously filter by type as well. And you can also pretty easily kind of negate it and say dash something, and it will then exclude anything that has that match. I'm sure you can use regex for those that just want to kind of type out a whole bunch of regex. I'm sure you can do that as well. I'll skip that part of the demo. There's also the performance. You can actually do a whole bunch of performance counters as well, built inside of the browser. I'm not going to demo that, but certainly have a look at the performance object to give you a lot better control over measuring functions and measuring kind of groups of functions as well. It's much better than just trying to manipulate the date time. So the next one which I found was quite useful. So presuming we've got an object, let's just kind of do something random. Need to zoom in as well. So fairly often, I want to copy that into the clipboard, and obviously you can go and kind of drag and select and copy, but there's a copy command as well that you can just say copy the object, and then if I just paste, it's there, which is pretty useful as well. So it's not going to be one thing that's going to kind of make your life better, but I think there's a whole lot of small things that kind of add up. Okay, cool. Let me just double check which script I've got running. Okay, let's get rid of that. Okay, so if we wanted to go and debug this add numbers, and I purposely kept it really simple just so it doesn't kind of obfuscate anything, we could go and put a breakpoint, which I'm sure you've all done. That's really simple. The other way to do it is to go into the code base itself and go and add debugger, which will go and force a breakpoint. The other thing that you can do, which is pretty useful, is get back to where it was. So I can actually say debug and give it the function variable. And then if I click, without having to put a debugger in there, it'll actually break in there, which is also pretty useful. So either putting debugger or putting a breakpoint or using that debug. And it's just going to wrap the function, so it's a very simple thing about what it's doing. But I think it's pretty useful. All right. Okay, I'm going to skip doing breakpoints within the line, so you can actually do a breakpoint if you had a bunch of nested statements, which I guess is an anti-pattern in itself. You could go and put a breakpoint somewhere along that line, which is quite a cool thing. Conditional breakpoints are also useful. And this is something that we've had in going to say proper languages, in other languages for a long time. So it's useful that they've actually added it now into DevTools. They've also added a continue to here. So if you're debugging and you want to, not debug up and you want to just continue debugging at a certain point, you can now use the continue to here gesture. And they've also fixed like a usability thing. If your page was stuck in an infinite loop, you can actually break out of that and get a breakpoint going again. So that's pretty useful. So looking at some of the networking things that they've added, let's just get to the networking tab. I'm always too scared to close tabs because then you don't remember how to bring up the drawer or anything like that. Okay, so I've just got a really simple get to JSON placeholder just to kind of demo some HTTP stuff, and it's returning some really basic JSON, which is cool. So what you can do, which is a nice thing to do, it's not always going to be that useful depending on what kind of frameworks you're using, is we can put a breakpoint on an XHR request. So I can say break whenever the URL contains the word to-dos. And then when I click, it's going to put a breakpoint somewhere random in one of the frameworks that I'm using. But there's kind of ways around that, which I'll show now. But this is pretty useful. So if you know that something's happening and there's a network call happening at some point and you want to actually just break at that network call, you can do it from the network layer itself as opposed to the code. So that's breakpoints. So the other thing that they've added is the ability to search on the network layer itself. Let's try that again. So you can search on, can't really see it in the bottom left corner, but you can search on headers, which is pretty useful. So if you know that one of your calls is passing a certain header or receiving a certain header, you can search based on the actual headers that are getting tracked in the network layer. And you can also simply filter out based on certain methods. If you only want to see the posts or the gets or whatever you want to do, you can do that all within inside of DevTools, which is pretty cool. And if we go back to the networking layer, you can right-click and copy. You can copy as the fetch. I'll just show you what that looks like. So it gives you the fetch command. No, you can't really see it properly there. But if you wanted to do some really quick prototyping for something and you wanted to copy that out, this is similar to what you get with Postman, the way it will do a little bit of code gen around the network call itself. And there's a curl as well, and HAR as well. So depending on what tooling you use outside of DevTools, you can use things like that, which is pretty useful. Okay, and the HAR you can import and export, which I guess you would presume that you could. So one of the issues that you'll have is, for instance, in the network tab, the initiator is not necessarily your client code. It could be something further down the framework stack that you're using, which doesn't really help you because I don't really care what Zone is doing. Maybe I should, but I definitely don't. So seeing it as the initiator for the call doesn't really help me. So what you can do is you can mouse over it, so it brings up this whole huge tooltip, which is fine. And now they've introduced something called black boxing. So you can actually black box a script, and what that means is it kind of removes it from your kind of field of vision. So if we go to the top, which is the one that was kind of blocking the meaningfulness of that column, I can right-click or double-click, whatever it is, and say black box the script. And what that does is it actually just removes that script completely from, again, from kind of how you're perceiving what's happening. It's still there functionally, but it's not going to show it. So now we can see that the initiator is actually the thing that we actually care about, which is pretty cool.
That should be in the Angular docs.
It should be, yeah. And you can also use that same thing from sources. So if we're going to go and debug, let me just show you the before and after. So I'm going to step into, because it's my code. It's not going to be like an Angular thing that disappears for like half an hour. So I've got two scripts. So it's kind of gone from one to the other. So let's presume that this one is not doing anything that we care about. It's doing some plumbing. It's not for human consumption. Just kind of ignore it. But it's always going to interfere with your debugging. So we can do exactly the same thing. If I step into it the first time, what I can do is I can right-click and I can say black box the script. And then the next time I break into that, even if I step in, it's not going to step into that black box script, which is pretty useful. So fairly often you've got these big chunks of code that you never want to step into. So using the black boxing that you can actually get around that, which is cool. And at some point you want to figure out what you've actually black boxed and unblack box it, because you're going to black box the wrong thing. So there is a setting, you can go into it and you can just remove that exclusion really simply. And you can also use patterns as well. So if you've got certain patterns of scripts that you know you must always ignore, you can use the regex instead of going into individual ones, which is pretty useful. As far as I know, that's a reasonably new thing. Okay, so we've had a look at black boxing. So one of the things that I'm definitely guilty of is not throttling my CPU and my networking when I'm testing. I can't believe I'm the only one who doesn't do that. So typically you're sitting on like a 100 megabit line and you've got a MacBook that costs more than like a bunch of people's cars and like a fancy phone, and you think, well, it works fine for me, let's like ship it, which is not always the best thing. So using Chrome DevTools, it's very simple to throttle your performance and your networking as well. It's probably not going to be the most realistic, but I know it is something that they've been improving. So you get a high end and a low end 3G, and you can throttle the CPU. So it's probably a lot better than doing nothing. So depending on how many animations you're doing and kind of really how much you care about the finer grained performance, it's trivial to add the frames per second. So you can track what's happening from a UI performance point of view, which is pretty cool. Let's just turn that off. Let me show you Node debugging pretty quickly. So I've got a really simple script that's just starting a Node server. It's kind of the one of the hello world. And instead of just doing Node index.js, I'm doing Node -- inspect index.js. Apparently it matters a whole lot, the order that you do that. I didn't think it would, but that was me trying it and then swearing subtly at the back of the room. My demo is broken. So what I've done is I've started that, and what I can then do is go to Chrome, inspect, and because of the fact that there's a whole bunch of standards kind of being used here, we can actually go and inspect that node process. So there's our code, and we can put a breakpoint, and we can hit it as a normal HTTP server, and we can actually breakpoint, kind of step through and things like that, which is pretty useful. I don't know the use of this if you're using something like VS Code or WebStorm or one of the other tooling. I think that'll be a bit kind of heavier weight. But certainly for something simple, if you wanted to just go and debug and see what is going on, that's probably not a bad way to do it. All right, stop that. Okay, so the next thing, which I'm not actually going to go into, I'm just going to kind of show it for those that aren't aware. Although I guess I can run it for what it's worth. There used to be an external tool called Lighthouse, and now it's an internal tool as part of Chrome now, or part of the dev tools. And this is a really easy way of getting a quick performance metric of your site. There's a lot of PWA specific things, which is fine, but I think it also gives you insight into a whole bunch of other metrics that you might not be aware of if you're using the site. So let's just let it finish up for a second or two. I don't think that's going to help the metrics very much. Oh, here we go. Okay. So here's the report. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit. So obviously this gives you very high level stats of where you are, and then you can drill down and actually get a lot more detail about the profiler and what's actually happening. This is definitely not something I'm going to cover at all because we're pretty much out of time. But if you care enough about the performance, I think this is definitely a place that you need to go in and actually figure out, the nitty-gritty of what's going on. Because fairly often we do simple things that seem to work fine, and then suddenly you've got, 1,000 rows instead of 100 rows, and things kind of grind to a halt. And it's this area of DevTools that's really going to help you figure that out. Let's see if I can go back.
Before you move on,
Shoot.
one nice thing about it as well is that it gives audit suggestions. So it shows you where the problem is, but it also says what you can do to fix it. It's a great way to learn.
Yeah, cool. And two of the things that are really important as well is it gives you timing on the first meaningful paint, which is one of the metrics that's kind of got more and more popular over the last sort of 2 years. And that is how long does it take until something meaningful actually gets painted on screen. There's no point having banner ads and whatever else as the first thing that gets rendered. You want to have your news headline or whatever it's going to be as the main thing that gets rendered first. And the first meaningful paint is the metric that's going to help you figure out how long it takes to do that. There's a timeline at the bottom that you can actually figure out after X number of seconds, where is the rendering? Is it meaningful, is it not meaningful? So first meaningful paint is really important. And also the time to interactivity as well is really important. So how long is it going to take until the user can actually click on the save button or the next button or whatever it is? Okay, let's see if there's any other ones. Okay, I think the last thing I'm just going to demo is not really part of DevTools itself. It's using Puppeteer, which is a way to use headless Chrome and actually use it for some sort of automated testing, which is quite cool. Let me just get to that spot. Just give me 1 second. So as part of Puppeteer, they give you a couple of kind of recipes that you can play around with. This one's pretty cool. This one gives you side-by-side browser windows, and it will show you the rendering speed. So I actually went in and fiddled with the code a little bit because it looked like it was rendering at the same speed, which seems a bit pointless. So I made the one kind of a slow 3G and the other one a normal speed, whatever the slow 3G is I'm on. And you can actually see the rendering speed of how quickly it actually takes. And they give you the code, so you can just go and modify it if you want. But it's a pretty cool metric to get. And this is probably something that you could fit into a build pipeline as well. So to figure out how long it actually takes until until the network activity is stopped, which is where that metric comes in, which is quite cool. So you don't have to just eyeball it, you can actually get that data churned out. And that's using Puppeteer. All right, cool. So that's pretty much the end of what I'm going to show you. There's a whole bunch more, so I really do encourage you to go in and have a look. Things like code coverage are really useful. So again, it doesn't negate all the other tooling that we use, but the fact is that it's built in and it's probably directly in the browser that you're testing in. It's definitely a good thing to go and dig in and just kind of have a bit more of a look at. All right, cool. Thank you very much.